You've heard of love at first sight, but what about marriage at first sight? It might sound strange, but for two British royals, it was the beginning of a beautiful and tragic romance. The coronation of King Charles III on May 6, 2023 put British royal history on the minds of millions worldwide. For a 1-2 royal punch, you can throw in Queen Charlotte: A Bridgerton Story, a Netflix miniseries that premiered around that same time. A continuation of the hugely popular 2020 series Bridgerton, Queen Charlotte is based on the true story of Great Britain's King Charles III and his wife Charlotte.
I will stand with you between the heavens and the earth. I will tell you where you are. Do you love me?
I love you!
King George III and Queen Charlotte were married in 1761, and their royal ceremony took place in something of a hurry. In fact, George and Charlotte's wedding was held the very same day she arrived in England from her home in Germany. George was only 22 years old at the time, and Charlotte was just 17, so why the big rush? George, who ruled over England until 1820, had taken the British throne 1 year earlier. Unfortunately, however, he was unmarried. This is the reason the marriage happened so quickly. George needed an heir to carry on the royal line. At least at first, the pairing of George and Charlotte was a matter of royal necessity. Luckily, though, George and Charlotte grew close despite their hasty nuptials. As king, George was head of the Church of England, and as such he could not marry a Catholic, which narrowed down the selection process for his queen. Luckily, Charlotte, the daughter of a German duke, was a Protestant. Being an aristocrat and a member of the right church, Charlotte was the perfect fit. Like George, Charlotte was also intellectually curious, holding creative interests and a passion for nature and the outdoors. Both Charlotte and George loved music, for example. Charlotte was also kind and even-tempered, based on accounts from the era. So although their courtship was brief and largely formal, the marriage between George and Charlotte worked out pretty well. They had 15 children together, and naturally one of them became the next King of England, George IV. A letter to King George from Charlotte, written 30 years after their wedding, read, "I have this instant been made very happy with your very affectionate and kind letter, for which I want words to express both my joy and happiness. But I can say with great truth that though my pen cannot express my feeling, my heart most deeply feel." The happy relationship between King George III and Queen Charlotte became troubled, though, as George infamously developed behaviors later on in his life consistent with bipolar disorder and chronic mania. At that time, George's mental health issues were described as madness, and modern scholars believe an arsenic treatment may have played a part in his decline. Despite the fortuitous nature of their arranged marriage, the love story between George and Charlotte has a sad end. George's plummet into mental illness began in 1788, and it's said that by 1789, Charlotte's hair had gone completely gray as a result of the strain of her husband's health woes. The couple, along with some of their daughters, moved to Kew, thinking a change of scenery may be good for him, but his doctors insisted on keeping the king secluded, even from Charlotte. Meanwhile, whatever they were doing wasn't helping him to improve. Near the end, George failed to recognize his wife at all, and later on he was prone to bouts of violence so extreme, Charlotte could no longer be left alone with him. Still, she cared for her husband the best she could until her own death in 1818 at 74 years old. After Charlotte's death, George's health worsened to such a degree that the future King George IV was declared regent in 1811. He eventually succeeded his father upon his death in 1820. King George III and Queen Charlotte are buried side by side in the royal vault of St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. As a witness at their wedding later said, "No couple had ever been happier than they were before this greatest of all misfortunes."